This has been a conversation that I have been waiting to have ever since I saw an interview that today's guest had with Carl Lentz. Some of you watching this, you might be familiar with Carl's story and you might be familiar with the podcast that he has, Lights On. However, I was not aware of today's guest until he appeared with Carl on Lights On. And so, for those of you that don't know, I would like to introduce you to Blaine Bartel. And so, Blaine, before we go any further, I want to thank you for just agreeing to come on and have the conversation with me.
Hey, it is. You came highly recommended from a good friend of ours, Chuck Tate. So I love Chuck, and any friend of Chuck is a friend of mine. So it's good to see you, Stephen.
It's good to see you. Uh, these are conversations, so you get a little bit of background about me. These are conversations I wish I had when I was younger. I'll be
Mm,
43 next month. I don't want to say that they would have kept me from making some of the mistakes that I've made. I don't want to say that they would have been a complete solution to some of the choices and decisions that I've made. But what I'm ultimately striving to do is create a safe space and a community. I'm trying to take the conversations that most people shy away from, the topics that most people shy away from, and especially in the church, because when someone has a story like yours, people don't want to talk about it. It makes them uncomfortable and they kind of squirm in their seats. But I'm becoming more and more aware of the fact that the conversations we're trying to avoid are more often than not the conversations that we actually need to be having. So, with
mm.
that being said, for anyone that does not know you or your story, can you, as if you're walking me through it for the first time, can you walk me through your own story and your own journey as if you were sitting in the studio with Carl Lentz on Lights On and giving it for the first time?
Sure. Yeah. I'll stop every so often in case you want to interject or if you're getting bored, but I'll go back. So I'm not 43. I'm in my 60s, and I started in ministry in the late 70s, early 80s, and so I was uh I was very ambitious, Stephen, as a young minister. I wanted to make a dramatic impact in my world. I grew up really with a real fascination of television and media. And so, when I started doing student ministry in my really my late teens and early 20s, I had this vision to do a television show. And somehow through a series of events that happened. And we started this fledgling little television program called Fire by Night in 1986. The first thing we did was just create a video. We sold the video to 300 churches to pay for the production. And gradually that little TV production grew into something pretty significant. And so within about 7 years, it was being broadcast on all the Christian networks, et cetera, et cetera. It was being sent to 500 or no, 5,000 churches, to show in their youth groups, and so, uh, I just was thrust into, like, in the late '80s, early '90s, kind of the Christian spotlight, especially when it comes to student ministry, and so I was, very, very busy, and I loved it. I enjoyed it. I love Jesus, and I love preaching the gospel. But, I think, on some level, during that season, Stephen, I really began to chase my own ambition and my own achievements more than I did really the kingdom of God and really care for my own soul. So I remember I went through about a 2-year period where I was gone every weekend speaking from Friday to Sunday and then doing television programming Monday through Friday and really never taking a break. I mean, never taking a day off, never taking Sabbath, gone from my family, my wife, and my 3 kids a lot. And I remember sitting one night, I would have been 28 years of age, probably, 8 years into this work, and sitting in a hotel room late at night after preaching the whole weekend. I'm sitting on the edge of the bed and I'm watching television and I'm flipping channels, like men do. We just got the remote and I'm checking out the news and I'm checking out sports and I'm checking out, are there any good movies on? Just something to wind down with at the end of the weekend. And for whatever reason, I was so exhausted and felt so overworked really because of my own doings, but I had this feeling like I deserve a break. Like I'm never home. I never see my wife. I never see my family. I'm doing all this. And there was a white box on top of that television with a red button. And I knew what it was. It was on all the TVs and all the hotel rooms back in that day. And it was an adult movie box, basically pornography. And I'd never looked at pornography a day in my life. Understand this is in the, late 80s and there's no internet. The only way you're going to find porn in the late 80s is a magazine, behind a counter in a convenience store or on a hotel television with that white box. And so against my own values, against my own faith, against what I knew to be true and right, I just like, it was almost like I just aimlessly got up and hit that red button. And I allowed myself to just engage in this illicit pornography for probably 10 or 15 minutes. And I felt these competing emotions. I felt, excitement, the allurement of it, like the curiosity of I've never seen this before. And wow, the lust, all of that feeling. And then especially after that competing feeling of shame and knowing that somehow I'd made a really horrible mistake and that I had sinned grievously, not just against the Lord, but against my own soul. I knew that. And so I tell men all the time that the worst mistake I made that night was not hitting the red button. The worst mistake, the more grievous sin, I guess, would be I got up from that bed after turning off the television. I went down to the front desk and I caught the attention of the clerk and I asked them if I could pay for my movie so it wouldn't go on the hotel bill so that the church that was hosting me wouldn't see what I had watched. And so they
Mm,
did, and it was erased. And it was, the beginning of what would become a 23-year cover up. I did not know
mm,
that would happen. I did not even anticipate doing this ever again. I remember, going back to my room that evening and then again in the morning and prayerfully asking God to forgive me, repenting, opening my Bible, reading Psalm 51, praying the prayer of repentance that David prayed. I felt so awful, and I had no plans to ever return to that, and I didn't for about 6 months, and so 6 months later, I am in another hotel room, another city. Once again, I've allowed my soul to bear thin. I am exhausted again. Recall what I did that last time and 6 months ago, and I fall for the trap again. Do it again. This time again, there's repentance, there's remorse, but then it's 3 months and then it's a month until Steve and I guess just over time, probably over the course of at least 2 to 3 years, it moved from kind of a choice, a curiosity to a habit to a stronghold
mhm,
to really an addictive force in my life. And
mm,
over time, I just couldn't win the battle. It was like no matter how hard I wanted to say no, I couldn't say no. I just kept saying yes. And the reason that the more grievous sin that first night was going down to the hotel clerk and erasing that movie off the bill was because it was a cover up. And what I should have done as I look back today and I know today is I should have reached out for help. I should have went to a brother, went to a pastor, went to somebody that I trusted and just said, "Hey, I made a really bad mistake this weekend. Let's talk about it. Let's, speak into my life. What do I need to do to avoid this in the future? Do I need to withdraw from traveling like I have been? Obviously, do I need to spend more time with my family, with my wife? What adjustments, what changes do I need to make in order for this not to become an issue again? And I didn't do that. And I think as men, as we speak to men who watch your pod, I think as men, it is one of the most natural things in the world for us just to say, I can win this. I can beat this. I've beat other things. I've conquered this. I won this. So I can win this battle. And I think as men, we have to get to this place, especially with consequential sin that could destroy us, to realize the best thing that we can do when we find ourselves in that arena, when we find ourselves being broken down by that, whether it's that, or maybe it's alcohol, or maybe it's a drug, or maybe it's our anger, whatever it is, to dare to have the courage to reach out. So I'll kind of stop there. There's a lot more to the story, but I'll let you interject.
There's so much to unpack, and I have the added advantage of having heard two previous conversations that you've had. You know what? It's interesting that you talk about a cover up, and you essentially talked about two cover ups. You talked about the initial cover up that night where you went down to the front desk, and then you talked about ultimately a 23-year cover up. And it's amazing because you mentioned Psalm 51 and David's prayer of repentance, and the story of David is one that's often fascinated me because his story doesn't begin with him on a rooftop. His story doesn't begin with him engaging in an illicit affair. His story doesn't begin with him lying or murdering. His story begins when he stopped doing what was right. At a time when kings would go out to battle, he chose to stay behind. And it was when we stopped doing what we know we are supposed to be doing that I think we make ourselves more susceptible to temptation, to the attacks of the enemy. The reason why I say that, Blaine, because I hear your story, right? And on paper, people would look at you and people would be like, but Stephen, he was doing it. He was doing the right things. He was in ministry. He wasn't saying no to all of these different things. You were busy. You were fulfilling God's call on your life. And yet this was something that I'm convinced we contend with two things. We contend with a very real enemy and we contend with our flesh, and they oftentimes work in tandem together. So the question that I would have is, let me frame it this way. I heard a conversation with Mike Singarelli, and people he's known as a deliverance minister, and someone came up to him wanting to be delivered from lust, and his question was, can I be honest with you? And the person responded by saying yes. And he says, I don't perceive that you have a lust problem. I perceive that you have a discipline problem.
Mm.
So the question that I have, and the reason why I frame all of that is what would you say is it was the root cause? What would you say? Was it the exhaustion? Was it the curiosity? Or was there something deeper that ultimately prompted you to not only engage in the cover up? Because Blaine, I've been guilty of it. Okay, so let me give you a little bit about my story. So I was previously married for 15 years, and I remember towards the end of my marriage, my ex-wife and I, we had just gotten back from the island of Oahu in Hawaii. It was our second trip to Hawaii. We had gone to Israel. We were debt free. We were sitting on six figures in savings. We had two vehicles. So on paper, we looked like we had everything together. But yet we came back from Hawaii Memorial Day weekend and 4th of July weekend. I was on a plane flying to California to have an affair with a previous coworker. And I cheated. I committed adultery. I committed fornication. And I remember carrying it on for, it was at least a 3 or 4 day window that I did it. On the plane ride home, I was texting my brother, telling him I was going to divorce my wife, telling him that I was going to file paperwork. I was prepared to move to California. And I remember the guilt. I remember the shame. I remember the regret, like you talked about, the remorse when you knew you had done something grievously wrong. And I was in church that Sunday, and the weight of what I had done, the conviction was so strong that I remember going to the pastor and just confessing, like, this is what
Mm.
I did. And Three solid leaders in the church, they brought me out of the sanctuary into a smaller room, not to condemn me, not to accuse me, but just to love on me. We're here for you. And it began a process not only of healing, but it began a very painful process that would ultimately end my marriage. And to this day, looking back on it, one of the biggest questions that I have asked myself is what was the root cause? And I didn't have accountability. Like you said, I didn't have I attempted to do marriage from a place of isolation. I attempted to do marriage without having a community of brothers around me. I attempted to do marriage without a fellowship. I thought I could be a lone ranger, and I thought just Jesus in me was sufficient. So the question that I have, and the reason I give you all that framework, the reason why I tell you a little bit about my story and where I've been is because I'm curious. Would you say that it was ultimately lust that began to entangle you and began to ensnare you, or was there something deeper that ultimately set the trap for you?
Yeah. Well, I really believe it is yes, 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 yes. So it's all of the above. I think the biggest mistake I think in the church that we make in dealing with lust or pornography or resistance, especially with men trying to resist lust, porn, etc., is that basically the only thing we really tell most men in the church is just have accountability. Just make sure you got somebody that is quote your policeman. Well, if you know where the police are, you can avoid them. If you know who your accountability partner is and you don't want to see him, you can avoid him. So that's a part of it. That could be I think maybe 10% of the work we can do to stop lust or to break the power of it. But I really believe, after, it's been 16 years since my train wreck. And I mean, part of what I do today is coach men out of sexual brokenness and sexual addiction. And without a doubt, there is always something deeper. There was always a root cause, and usually multiple root causes. So it may be they're very, very disillusioned with God. It may be they're very, very unhappy in their marriage. It may be that they got married with a preacher telling them that, if you save yourself till marriage, sex will be amazing. They go on their honeymoon, they have sexual issues with their wife. Maybe their wife has grown up with sexual trauma. She doesn't know how to engage in a healthy way. He's disappointed. And so he resents God. He resents his wife and he's mad at the world. Well, is he going to be suspect to pornography or lust or an affair? Absolutely. Is a man that was once a boy who was molested by his boss or by his babysitter going to be susceptible to lust and the feeling of exploring his sexuality more because it was taken from him when he was young and now he wants to be the one that takes it or be the one in control? Yes, of course it's going to be a root cause. So that's why, Stephen, I believe that when Jesus showed up on the earth, he didn't show up with the 10 commandments. He didn't show up in the synagogue after his baptism and say, okay, let's just get this straight. You guys are murdering, committing adultery, you're lying, you're not honoring your parents. He didn't list the 10. He got into the room, into the synagogue, and he said, let me just read to you from Isaiah what the issue is. He said, the Lord has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He said, number one, you're poor, or you have a poverty of soul. He said, he's called me to heal the brokenhearted. So your heart is broken. There's pieces of your heart lying on the floor because you had desires and hopes and dreams, and all of those are shattered. And then he says, I've come to set the captives free. So some of you are captive and don't know how to get out. You're captive to maybe a habit or captive to a stronghold or captive to a relationship, and you don't know how to quit. And so I'm here to set you free. And then he ended it by saying you're blind and you need to have a vision for life and for God and for what it means to thrive as a human being. And then he said, I've come to give you jubilee. In other words, you don't understand forgiveness. And so I truly believe that for men to conquer pornography, alcoholism, any addiction, they have to do the or allow the deep work of healing, the deep work of Jesus setting them free. And of course, that's more than just a prayer. That's more than just, going down to an altar and, asking a preacher to pray for you. It's much more than that. Of course, there's disciplined parts of our life that we need to engage in, whether it's worship or reading or prayer or engaging in brotherhood, engaging in advocacy, being a part of a community, all of those things. But yes, it is a root. And it's not just saying, I'm going to finally get my willpower strong enough to say,
Yeah.
no, we've got to go
Yeah.
deeper than that.
I'm trying to picture because your story has profoundly impacted me. I must have listened to each of those conversations probably 2 or 3 times over and listened to each of them. And you talked about a 23-year battle, and I know what you described earlier. You only touched the surface. So, Blaine, what I'd like to ask you is walk us through 23 years as much as you can and as best as you can. Walk us through what it was like during those 23 years, because ultimately there would come a point in your life where you experienced, whether you want to call it rock bottom, whatever you want to call it, you experienced a moment where you could no longer run. You could no longer hide. You could no longer cover up. And that was an ultimately, and for anybody that doesn't know your story, you took, I believe it was 3 or 4 years off without doing any type of ministry. You took time to heal, you took time to grow, you took time to get your heart and your mind and your soul and your spirit right. So walk me through what that time was like, because you carried an addiction for 23 years, and the
Yeah.
guilt and the shame and the condemnation that came with it, because I can only imagine what that was like for you.
Yeah. Well, let me preface by just saying this. I don't glory in this story at all. I hate my past. The only reason I share it so freely is simply because the Lord asked me to. He said, I want you to be candid and honest about your story. And I don't want you to
Uh,
glorify it or make it bigger than it is or worse than it is. Nor do I want you to be salacious in the way you tell it, but I want you to tell it because it will give the freedom for other men to tell their stories that are in hiding. So that's why I share this. So the lie that pornography, I think that I believed about pornography is it was on some level, even though I knew it was sinful, that it was somehow harmless, that, I wasn't with a real person. Nobody knew about it. The women I was watching on the porn, they didn't know I was watching them. So it was kind of a harmless activity. It was just me, myself, nobody else. And so I guess I kind of gave into that idea that, yeah, it's not really what I want to do. I know it's sinful. But I do want to try to stop it, but it's not it's not really that destructive. And here's why that lie is such a dangerous belief in our head is lust never quits. Lust always is on the accelerator. Lust never coasts and never goes into neutral. So what I discovered was I kept wanting more. So I wanted like more porn or more uh, more illicit porn. And then after I went down, as many different roads of the porn world as I'm sure I could at that time. Then it was like, oh, I wonder what would be like to be with somebody that was real. So that resulted in, seeing these 900 numbers on television and starting to engage in chat lines at whatever it was, $3 or $4 a
uh-huh.
minute. So now I'm talking to somebody, I don't see them. They don't know who I am. I don't know who they are, but again, it's gone that next step. I'm spending more money and I'm encountering real sexual emotions with this person on the end of a phone line. Well, that lasts for a few years and that becomes very, very addictive almost every weekend when I'd be gone. And then it was like, okay, the lust wanted more. And I remember looking out a window of a hotel room one night and seeing a kind of a massage parlor down the road, and it was kind of in a dark area. It was not a well lit area. It didn't look like, kind of, I don't know, a franchise massage like, in a mall. It was sketchy. And somehow I just knew it was sketchy. And so I remember walking down, I won't go through the whole story, but eventually I find myself in that space putting down money for sexual favors with this woman in this room. And that, Stephen, just, it was like when I crossed that line and I was actually, with another person that was not my wife. It was a brutal line. I felt like there was no turning back. It was at that moment I felt like I can't possibly tell anyone this now because it will destroy me, my wife, my family, my
Mhm.
marriage, my 3 teenage boys. Like, I have got to keep this under wraps. I've got to stop it. I've got to hide it. And that didn't happen. I I couldn't stop it. And it just got worse. And it went from that to, escorts from time to time to just as the internet came on, random hookups on the internet. Never really, I mean, when I look back, I had a wonderful wife. I had a wonderful family. I had I would say like a decently good marriage. We got along well. My ministry is still flourishing. I don't know why, but it was. And so I just got really good at hiding things. I mean, I had a secret phone, I had ways of hiding it on my computer. I mean, there were just all kinds of ways. I hid it in my bank account, my spending, all of that. Like you said, 23 years later, death came knocking at my door. And I guess I'm reminded at this moment of Psalm, or not Psalm, but Proverbs chapter 7. And it's an
Mhm.
amazing proverb that, the father speaks to the son about the dangers of lust, the dangers of the lust of men, choosing fantasy, choosing sexuality that doesn't belong to us, because that's ultimately what sin is. Sin is taking what is not ours. Sin is taking what does not belong to us. That was Adam and Eve in the garden. They took what didn't belong. And so finally, death came knocking on my door. And as happened in Proverbs 7, the young man who is naive and in the street and encounters this woman who's offering a night of sexuality because her husband is gone. So basically, come commit adultery with me. She presents his fantasy. He bites the apple. He takes the fantasy. And the end of Proverb 7 says, and in the end shall be his death. He'll be pierced through with many swords and he'll end up in a coffin. And so that coffin came knocking on my door in 2010, 23 years after that first encounter with pornography. And I was with a woman that was not my wife. I was not trying to have an affair with her. It was just a random encounter, somebody I met on the internet. And she was not an escort. She was not a sex worker. She was just a human being who thought she was dating or going out with a single man. But she was smart
Mhm.
and she was discerning. She figured out who I was that night and she broke me. She said, "You are
Mhm.
done. I know you're a liar. I know you're a deceiver. I know who you are. I found you on the internet. I know you're a pastor. I know you're married. And you either go home and confess everything, or I will go to the Dallas Morning News and I will expose you." And our church at
Mhm.
that time in North Dallas was growing. It was one of the fastest growing churches in the area at the time. We just moved into a brand new building. We had nearly 1,000 people in 3 years. And so all this stuff is happening. And literally, Stephen, in 30 seconds, I realized my life is over. I realized she has me
Mhm.
in a trap and in a box. And there is no way out. There is no way of escaping this time. And I call it the day of God's terrifying grace because it was terrifying because I knew life was going to end. I knew that my only option was confession and going back home and finally telling everybody who I really was. But I found it in the end to be the beautiful grace of God, that
Mhm.
grace can be found in the worst moments, in the worst places, with honesty, with confession, with humility, and with surrender. And so I did. I went back. I met with one of my best friends who was also on the board of our church. I confessed everything to him. He took me home. I confessed everything to my family, to my wife, to my children who were teenagers, early 20s, confessed everything to my board, resigned my church, met with some of my best friends. And yeah, stepped away from ministry. In fact, I wasn't taking a break from ministry. I just felt like it was over. I pursued secular
Mm,
work, and got secular work. I was working in marketing and had no plans to return to any kind of church world ministry. Yeah, it was awful, and mainly awful for my family, for my wife,
mm,
who after, at that time, 30 years of marriage, found out for the first time that her husband was living a double life, living a false life, that he was a hypocrite, that he was a liar, that he was a cheater. And I had to own all of that, that I didn't just make a few bad decisions. I had become a liar, a cheater, a
mm.
deceiver, a man that could not be trusted, and I needed deep, deep, deep help and work in my soul.
God's terrifying grace. The question that I really just think about is living in the light and living in the truth. It's interesting that Jesus said that you will know the truth and the truth will make you free. But yet, there is, especially as men, there's this fear that we have. There's this fear of exposure. There's this fear of living in the light. There's this fear of being clean, especially when we have lived with a mask for so long and we've presented this image. This is one of the things that I am learning myself growing up in the church and being a pastor's kid and going to Bible college, graduating from Bible college. I was a pastor at one point, but it's so easy to present these false images of who we are. It's so easy. But the problem that I'm realizing, Blaine, is that the longer you wear a mask, the longer you present a false image of yourself, the easier it is to forget who you really are because now your lies require lies, your lust requires more lust, your cover up requires a cover up. It's like what David did, right? He committed adultery with Bathsheba, but it didn't stop there. Now he had to find a way to cover it up because
Yeah,
it's one of the things that my mom quotes. My mom quotes this verse all the time, and she says, "Be sure your sins will find you out." It's what Moses
right.
said to the children
Yeah.
of Israel. And I
That's a
hate that
mom
verse,
verse right
honestly. And
there.
I'm it is. It's one of the verses in the Bible that I would say I don't really like, but it's so true because that's what happened with David. And for David, it came in the form of, "Hey, guess what? Bathsheba sent word, and I'm pregnant, and obviously it's yours because my husband is off to battle." So thus began a great cover up. The thing that the thing that fascinates me, and I don't know if fascinate is the right word, but the thing that intrigues me so much about David's story is would he have confessed if Bathsheba had never gotten pregnant, number one, and if Nathan had never confronted him and said, "You are that man"? Because I've been there. I've seen my dad walk through it. My dad was a pastor and my dad passed during COVID, so I'm okay sharing this story, but I remember even my dad developed a gambling addiction and we lived not far from Atlantic City. Long story short, I remember him having to resign his position. I remember the church having decided they were going to
Mm,
press charges against him.
wow.
I remember it nearly shipwrecked my parents' marriage, and somehow, by the grace of God, they stayed married until my dad ultimately passed away during COVID. It's you call it terrifying grace, God's terrifying grace, and I forget how you explained it on Lights On. You said something. God issued an arrest warrant. I think that's what it is. God
Yes.
issued an arrest warrant for your soul. And he did it in the most unlikely and terrifying way. And one word keeps coming over and over and over and over in my head as I'm hearing you talk, and that's simply the word relief. Was there a point in your life when you finally confessed, when you realized you were done hiding? You were done covering it up. You were done with all this. Was there ever a point during that process where you literally just took a step back, as painful as it was, you had kind of like a weird Selah moment where you're like, okay, this is what it's like to live completely, maybe not necessarily clean in the complete sense, but clean in the sense that now you've had to confess everything to your wife and to your kids and to your board because I
Yeah.
would imagine that a lot of men are afraid of the very thing that would bring them relief, the very thing that would bring them to the end of themselves. And I would say that's where you were. I mean, I've been there in certain ways in my own where I've it's as old as the garden. Right, Adam sinned against God, and what were the 2 things that he did? He hid and he covered up, and ever since then, he set forth a pattern, he set forth a precedent that we have been doing ever since. We are hiding and we are covering up, and was there a part of you that finally felt relief, even though it was painful and maybe even traumatic, knowing that the clock had run out and now you were forced to deal with it?
Absolutely. I guess it would have been about 6 years ago, I wrote a book, and I really debated on what the title would be of my story. And, I thought death by lust, death by sexual addiction, and I landed on this, death by a thousand lies. And the reason I don't even talk about lust in this title is because the lies were the problem. My gateway to freedom was confession. My gateway to freedom was disclosure. Thank God that woman forced me into a corner of disclosure. It was the thing that saved me. And yes, I can tell you, even though I didn't experience freedom from my addictive life right away, I did experience a sense of hope and relief that I wasn't alone in my secrets anymore, that I had men and pastors and family that were there, that were checking in with me, that were giving me, you know, helpful decision making processes. So, yeah, for the first time, I felt hope that I could win this battle. There was still a lot of work to do, a lot of what I call resurrection work to do. But yeah, that is the beginning. And that's why confession to God is not enough in the Christian faith. It is just not enough. I
Mm,
mean, for us as Protestants, we can be very critical of Catholics, but I'll tell you one thing. If there was one thing I would adopt as a Protestant pastor today, it would be a confessional booth. It would be this
mm,
idea of
yeah,
there is a trustworthy place where you can confess your sins to a brother, to a pastor, to somebody that loves you and cares for you and can pray for you. Because that's what James said, that if we confess our sins one to another, pray for one another, there's healing. And so there's forgiveness from God,
yeah.
but healing comes through confession. And so, yeah, confession and disclosure and honesty was the beginning of a brand new life for me. And by the way, for me 16 years later, confession never ends. I may not be confessing
Right.
today to pornography or to hiring an escort or doing some of the things that I did 20 plus years ago, but I'm telling you that there are no secrets in my life at all today. I have
Mm,
fully embraced the idea that if I have something that is sinful or something that is harmful in my life, I've got brothers in my life. I've got a wife that I can be vulnerable and transparent with. I've got sons even that love me and are there for me. So this idea of confession isn't just one time and we're done and we can just move on. It's a lifestyle. It's the way Christian community was meant to be lived. So I hope that makes sense.
it makes complete sense because I had a conversation with somebody who he had an affair and cheated on his wife, and it was a habitual thing for him. And we did a conversation like you and I are having, and he asked me the question on the recording. He asked, "Should I have confessed to my wife what I had done?" In other words, I confessed it to God, and God forgave me. I felt like God forgave me, but should I have confessed it to my wife? And of course, when he asked me this, I already had my own context of confessing it to the pastor, what I did, and confessing it to my ex wife, and all of these different things. I'm glad you brought up James 5 because it says that if we confess our sins, there's healing in it. I think that there's a power in confession because it invites God to step in and be your defense attorney. It invites God if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us. I'm reminded of the woman that was caught in the act of adultery and she was guilty by the law of Moses. She should have been stoned, she should have been dead. And yet we know the story. One by one they left, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest, and Jesus asks her, "Woman, where are your accusers?" And she says, "I have none." And he said, and his words next are so incredibly important because he says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." And I think there's this marriage between what you just said, even in that passage. I don't condemn you, but go and sin no more. And there's this continued need for confession. And I agree with you 100%. I don't think we put enough emphasis in confession. I don't think we put enough stock in it. I think confession and repentance are are some of the hardest words in Christian churches today because no one wants to do it. I mean, I struggle with it sometimes. And yet here's something that I'll never forget. The late David Wilkerson, he preached a message, and in his message, he said, "You are never more loved by God than when you're being disciplined by
Mm,
him,
yeah.
because he disciplines those whom he loves." And I look at what you went through and I see it as, yeah, this woman was being used as an instrument of God to expose, but she was also being used by another way. I see it as, you say it, God's terrifying grace, but I see it as God's unending love for you because it's through the conviction, it's through the discipline that he was able to restore you. And this is one of the things that I remember talking to Cody Jefferson about this. I remember listening to it because when you were talking to Carl on Lights On, you described a distinction, a difference. A lot of people would simply rebrand themselves in your situation, right? They come out on the other hand, they come out on the other side, they rebrand themselves. We're in a social media age where brand it reigns supreme, and you could have easily rebranded yourself, repackaged yourself, and yet you describe it as needing a full-fledged resurrection. You describe it as this, you in your book, Death by a Thousand Lives, you had to experience the death of everything that you knew. And quite honestly, you said you felt your ministry was over. You felt like you would never engage in ministry again. You pursued secular employment. You you perhaps thought your marriage was over, that you would lose your wife, you would lose your sons. And yet what I hear from you is a story of resurrection. And Blaine, this is one of the things that I'm reminded of. Jesus shows up at Lazarus' tomb. He could have put on a great display of power. He could have commanded the stone to be rolled away himself. It was rolled away at his own resurrection. He could have commanded the stone to be rolled away. He could have issued the same command, Lazarus, come forth. The grave clothes could have been left in Lazarus' grave like they were when he would be raised from death. But yet the first thing that he does before he displays his power, before he displays his might, he displays his
Mhm.
emotion. And it's simply that he wept. And I find great comfort in that because the very next thing that he did, he would look up to the Father, he would thank the Father. Lazarus come forth. Other people were required to roll away the stone. Other people were required to loose Lazarus and let him go, but Lazarus himself had to listen to the voice of Jesus. Lazarus himself had to obey and come out of that tomb. And I love that story so much because Lazarus came out very much alive, but he was still bound. And Blaine, this is one of the things that I think God is confronting me with, is that I think there's so many men that they're alive, they've come out of the grave, but they're still bound. They're still carrying the grave clothes of shame, the grave clothes of guilt, the grave clothes of condemnation, the residue or the remnants of what they had done. And yet I listened to your story, and you just mentioned your wife, you just mentioned your three sons. So here's the part of the story, Blaine, that I don't know. Here's the part that I don't believe that I heard in either one of the podcasts with Carl, is the after effect. Because what was it like? Because now you're in a point where you're engaged in ministry where you help men become delivered from this. But can you just describe for me what it was like afterwards with your wife and with your sons? Because it sounds to me like God in his mercy, God in his grace allowed you to be able to, guess, keep your marriage, keep your sons. What was it like to where you're at a point right now where you're able to minister to men? You have a loving wife, relationship with your sons. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, it was, it was complete loss of everything, complete death, financial
Mm,
bankruptcy. You know, when you leave really good income uh, in my ministry world at that time to nothing for a year, trying, you know, just in recovery, trying to figure out what to do, going to rehab, which was $30,000, going to 4 or 5 counseling appointments a week, and yeah, we and then as it would happen, the economy, the housing market fell out in 2010, and so through a series of events, I mean, we literally went bankrupt, and I lost complete relationship with everyone I pretty much everyone I know that I loved and cared for. My pastor didn't want to take my calls within a year, just a little bit less than a year. My wife filed for divorce. My kids, my 3 boys, did not want any kind of they might answer a phone call, but they really didn't want a relationship with me. Uh,
mm,
and then I couldn't find a job. I mean, I was like looking for work, trying. I mean, just looking. What do you do? And all you've done is taught for 30 something years. There's not a lot of jobs
mm.
out there. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd love for you to talk on a stage every weekend for me. You know, there's no jobs like that for a preacher, you know, that is out of the ministry. So yeah, it was really a tough time. I think I felt a little bit like Job, but except that my suffering was my own doing, but I felt away from God. I felt distant from God. I felt like the people, you know, the Job friends, I didn't feel like I was getting any help. I was aimless. And it wasn't really until Stephen you know, after going through rehab, you know, going through a year, losing my marriage, uh, trying to figure out what I was gonna do. I had a dear friend that invited me to Kansas City just to spend the weekend with him. He was a pastor. And I was driving back to Tulsa from Kansas City that end of the weekend. And I was just very quiet. I was very still and wasn't really even praying, but I heard this impulse in my soul. It wasn't like I heard it out loud, but I just heard these words in my spirit. Blaine, I'm not going to give you a recovery. I'm calling you into resurrection. And I really didn't
Mm,
quite know what that meant, but I stopped on the side of the highway and I wrote it down. And the next year or two, I just did this deep dive of prayerfully, deeply seeking Jesus on what it meant to live a resurrected life. And the first thing he offered me was death, because we don't get to Easter without going through Good Friday. Yeah, we have to encounter the cross.
that's right.
And I was brought to that passage where Jesus said, "If you want to be my disciple, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me." And Jesus actually said that before he ever went to the cross, but he invited his followers to
Yep.
deny self, deny ego, put down your pride, put down all selfish living, and to pick up your cross of suffering and follow Jesus, whatever that means. And so as best as I knew how, with the help of good men and good pastors in my life, I began to take on that mission of Jesus. And over time, I feel like I fully encountered the death that I needed to encounter, the death of self and the death of ego and the death of pride and the death of Blaine Bartell and his kingdom and his world, and to encounter the beauty of the kingdom of Jesus. I remember reading through the Sermon on the Mount and just thinking, man, I used to pass over this sermon because it was impossible. I couldn't love my enemies. I couldn't do good to those that harm me. I couldn't pray for those that were speaking evil of me. I mean, I was the opposite of that. I would get revenge. I would, you know, my enemies would go down. I mean, so God began to reform and resurrect my soul. And it took time, and it took the time that it takes for a seed to be planted and for it to slowly come up out of the ground and begin to at some point bear fruit. And slowly but surely over years, God began to resurrect my life. So, long story short, it would have been about 4 years after that. I met Lori, who is my wife today. We got married about a year after. God restored my relationship with my sons. God actually restored my friendship with my ex-wife, Kathy, and we have a beautiful friendship today. In fact, her and my wife, Lori, are very, very close friends, and we do holidays together and we do birthdays together and things like that. And then by God's grace, again, without any real desire on my part to return to ministry, God just kind of dropped this work that we do before us as a dream and a vision to help men in marriages and ministers that are suffering in sexual brokenness. And so I'm not a pastor today, and I don't lead a big church, and I have no aspirations of having another television show. I'm very much out of the public light, I would say, but I quietly go to work each day at a place we call House of Resurrection. And like tomorrow, 3 men
Hmm.
who are all struggling with porn, escorts, chat lines, affairs, marriage issues are all going to be showing up in that house, and I'm going to work with them for about 3 days, and then a year after that. So every guy, every minister, every marriage that comes in, we commit to the work that we do at that house. We call it residential work, counseling work, coaching work, intensive work, and then we have a program where we do a full year after that online. So we have online training, and we have phone calls and check-ins and things like that. So we've had that ministry together for probably 5, 6 years now, hundreds, really thousands of men that we've been able to help. We've seen over 100 pastors restored in their marriage, in their relationships, their ministry. And that's where my passion is. And it's the beauty of Jesus that he never resurrects us just to give us a badge and say, look at you. He always resurrects us for the next moment to bring him glory. It's like when, you talk about Lazarus. Jesus said the reason Lazarus is going to be raised from the dead is for the glory of God. Well, how did God get glory? Well, the story's been told for thousands of years, again and again and again and again, and God's received glory for it. But also, Lazarus, actually,
Yeah.
according to church history, actually, after Jesus died and rose from the dead, left Bethany, moved about 30 miles away, started a church, became a pastor of a New Testament first century church, and began to lead people to Jesus and then disciple them in faith. And I can only imagine the profound effect that this man had on the
Right.
lives of men and women. Can
Right.
you imagine Easter Sunday at Lazarus's church as he's preaching on resurrection, right? Like, so there's always there's
Right.
always God's always up to something behind the scenes in all of the work that he's doing in us. It's never just to heal us. It's never just to forgive us. It's never just to restore us or resurrect us. It is always for a greater kingdom outcome. And we don't know what that is, nor do we need to worry about it. We just let him bring it into our life like a day at a time, a step at a time. Resurrection is this idea, and it's a beautiful thing for those that are watching right now or listening. Resurrection is this idea that the worst thing is never the last thing with Jesus. The worst thing
Uh,
is never the last thing.
the worst thing is never the last thing. That's a good mic drop moment. That's a good way of thinking. The only thing that I can think of is imagine, so Lazarus was raised from death to life. The widow's son was raised from death to life. Jairus's daughter was raised from death to life. Jesus dies on the cross, and the graves of however many people were open, and upon his resurrection, those people came out of their graves. So, and then I call it the fellowship of the resurrected ones, is what I call it. Imagine during those days when Jerusalem and Judea and maybe Galilee, they all experienced this company of
Mhm.
resurrected ones, and all these people are saying the same thing. God has the ability of resurrecting that which was dead. God has the ability of bringing dead things. Blaine Bartell, can these bones live? Stephen Goodwin, can these bones live? Can this marriage live? Can this relationship live? Can this ministry live? Surely, Lord, only you know. And I love your story, and I love the concept of resurrection because it's what God has been speaking to me in my own life. And in order to experience resurrection, we have to experience death, whatever that death looks like, whatever it costs us, whatever it means. We have, and I love what you said earlier. Before the cross was ever the instrument of Jesus' suffering and death, it was the invitation to discipleship. Before he ever died on the cross, he signified that the way to identify ourselves as his disciples is to deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow him. The cross is a symbol of discipleship as much as it is a
Yeah.
symbol of salvation and redemption and restoration. And so, Blaine, I have one final question. If you could say anything to that person right now that's struggling with being willing to confess, they're living with cover up, they're living with lies, they're scared, they're afraid, they're afraid of what it might mean, they're afraid of it losing, they're afraid of it costing everything. If you could encourage that brother right now to embrace whatever pain comes, whatever suffering comes, whatever the cost, whatever the loss that comes through confession, if you could encourage that brother who is maybe on the fence that knows they need to do it, but they're hesitant in doing it, what would you say to that brother?
Well, two things. First of all, brother, if you're struggling and you've got secrets and you're hiding, I know where you are. There's fear, there is trepidation, there is the idea, what will people think of me? What my image, all of that. And can I tell you something, that one of the most beautiful parts of my life today that I get to live every single day is putting my head down at night on a pillow and knowing that I can go to sleep without secrets. That if I were to die tomorrow, my wife, my children, my best friends could go through my computer, my phone, my banking, my files, my drawers, my personal life, and there would not be a secret. It's a beautiful life to live. But the only way we get to that life is beginning with honesty, vulnerability, and confession. And that's hard. And the reason it's hard is because we're not sure who we can really trust. Who can we share this with that is not going to use it against us, that is not going to weaponize our confession and break us with it? And so I would encourage you, be very, very selective on where your confession goes. And if I did one thing right in
Mm,
that moment in 2010, is I found a gentleman, a friend, a brother of 20 plus years who I knew I could trust with my truth and with my story. And he was compassionate. He was truthful. He walked me through what I needed to walk through, but he never let me go. To this day, 16 years later, he calls all the time. How you doing? A brother that can be trusted.
mm.
You have to have that. So find that brother, find that pastor, find that confidant. They may not have all the answers, but they'll point you the right direction. They'll help you get the help that you need, and they'll pray for you. So that's the beginning. I'm not going to give you any more steps than that because it will overwhelm you. Just take that step. Pray. Say, God, who can I trust? Who can I speak to? Who can I confess to? And if you're really in trouble, I mean, if you've got some stuff going on and you need some real help and you want somebody you can trust, if nothing else, just to share your story with and have somebody to hear you and pray with you, reach out to me. You go to our website, there's all kinds of places that you can download, you can reach out for help, you can fill out forms, and I get all of them. I will respond to all of them. So that may be a first step for you, but reach out.
Blaine Bartell, this conversation was everything I thought it would be and more. And I want to, again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your willingness to have this conversation. I am very grateful that on a whim, I decided to reach out to mutual friend Chuck Tate and have a conversation with him. And he made the introduction. And so I want to thank you sincerely from the bottom of my heart. I almost feel like there needs to be a part two. I feel like there's still so much more to dive into. So I would invite you back on again for a part two and see where God leads us. But my friend, I am honored to call you a brother. I am honored to call you friend. And I tip my hat to you and I salute not you, but I salute the work that Christ has done in you and the man that he has raised you up to be. And I know the man that he's continuing to
Thank you,
raise you up to
Stephen.
be.
That means a lot, my friend. It's so good to meet you. God bless you, and God bless all of you, man, that have joined us for this pod. It's been a joy. Thank you.
All right.